Welcome to Despatches, a shorter podcast from the old front line and me, military historian Paul Reed. Trains, the railways, the war by timetable was an essential part of the history of the Great War, and those tracks and the routes of those trains weave their way through the landscape of the Western Front in Flanders. What can we learn by taking the train to Ypres? Each year, cars and coaches from Britain travel into Flanders at the border near Poperinghe. Beyond the border post that delineates France from Belgium, the first Great War cemetery you encounter as you come into that part of Flanders comes quickly into view. And that's the Beela Aerodrome Cemetery, close to the site of a Royal Flying Corps aerodrome, where RFC aircraft flew from there over the battlefields around Ypres and the Messines Ridge. It was also a place where men of the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee divisions buried their dead in 1918. There was a small American battlefield burial site there that was removed after the war, and those men repatriated or buried in Flanders Field Cemetery at Waregem, something we spoke about in our episode in Doughboys in Flanders. But you realise when you see that cemetery that you're back on the battlefield. You're entering that landscape of the Great War on the Western Front. But all those people who catch the splash of white stone and a glimpse of the cross of sacrifice from their speeding vehicle perhaps don't see, across to their right, a long embankment covered with bushes and small trees. It looks unimportant and neglected, and in the blink of an eye, it's gone. But yet, it is one of the most important features on this part of the Great War landscape, as that embankment was the route of the old railway line that ran for almost a century from northern France into this part of Flanders. And during the Great War, millions of men from all over the world came to and fro along that line, a line heading onwards, ever onwards, one way or another, to the city of Ypres, Ypres or Ypres, as it became known to the troops, and beyond that, the trenches of the Western Front. And later, when the war was ended and the battlefields were silent, it brought pilgrims onto that old front line for their own personal journeys across that new landscape of the Great War. We've often discussed the importance of railways in the conflict, and my mind turned to this important railway route on a recent visit to the area when I stopped to see some of the new work taking place at Lissenherk Military Cemetery. I was alerted to that by a friend who works as a school battlefield guide who'd seen some work going on there and asked if I knew what it was, and I didn't. And he discovered that this was a new building, an extension to the visitor centre there at Lissenherk, and that it will contain a diorama, adding a new level of understanding, I hope, to that site. So when I popped in there and went to have a look at this, to take some photographs for the podcast supporters newsletter, and have a think about that site as well. And I picked up a little booklet from an exhibition that was at Poperinghe a while back called Heavy Traffic, which is a little tiny pamphlet. It's only a few euros from a kind of dispensing machine in the visitor centre, and that tells the story of the railways in this part of the Flanders landscape from a Great War perspective. And that made me think about this subject and led me to this episode of Despatches. So what was the story of this train line into Flanders, and what crisscross pathways of the Great War do we find along it? As early as 1906, in that decade leading up to the Great War, one military strategist said, "Railways are the arteries of modern armies." We've often said that logistics and supply and lines of communication are just as important as the bombs and the bullets and the bayonets on the battlefields themselves. And that line that railways are the arteries of modern armies proved especially true with the outbreak of the Great War in 1914 when, as A.J.P. Taylor described it, this was war by timetable. The railways and trains played a vital part in those early months of the war. For the Germans, with the Schlieffen Plan, the movement of troops and shells and equipment all depended on the railways. They'd built special railway lines taking men to the border, special stations with massive platforms to unload troop trains to get men off and across the border from Alsace-Lorraine into eastern France to attack the French or to move to the Belgian border to begin their assault on the Liège forts. Railways were vital to them. And for France, it was no different. Moving men from their depots and their barracks and their headquarters in different parts of France via the railway system up towards central points during the Battle of the Marne. Men flooded into Paris, and the lines were so busy they couldn't get out onto the battlefields, and that was the famous taxis of the Marne. Vehicles then moved men from the railheads out onto the battlefield itself. So in those early weeks before the first British shot of the Great War was fired at Mons, the French and the Germans were using railways very much as part of their strategic plans to fight this war. And when Britain arrived and the expeditionary force moved across the Channel to set up its depot, it set it up in key locations where there were railway junctions and routes to take them to the places they needed to get to. And places like the railway lines at Rouen and Le Havre and across to Abbeville and Amiens were all part of that. And when the shift in the war moved from moving up to set up alongside our French allies and then crossing to fight the Battle of Mons in August 1914 and the great retreat from Mons that took the British Army over 200 miles from Mons to the Marne and the Battle of the Aisne, when the movement of troops went up into northern France and Flanders in the autumn of 1914, the so-called race to the sea, when the Germans were pushing on the Channel ports, railways became important, and the town of Hazebrouck in northern France, which sat at a main railway junction with all of those routes from the key places like Le Havre and Rouen and the coast at Boulogne and Calais and Arras and Amiens and Abbeville could all be reached by passing through Hazebrouck. Hazebrouck became this key juncture, and beyond Hazebrouck was the line that took you into Belgium. So trains proved just as important here to the movement of armies. And then when the front went static, the movement of men, equipment, supplies and ammunition up towards that static front line. So the train line from northern France into Flanders, the routes that went from Hazebrouck across the border to Poperinghe and to that old medieval city of Ypres, was officially known as Line 69. This line was originally begun in the 1850s when, like many other parts of Europe, Belgium began to develop its railway systems. But this section that went from France into Belgium opened in the 1870s, so a bit later, and would remain running until September 1970, although it was closed to passenger traffic a little bit earlier than that. It ran along more than 40 miles of track, and the routes continued for about a third of that distance from Hazebrouck via smaller stations to Poperinghe, and then onwards from there to Ypres. And beyond Ypres, it would continue to Courtrai, now Courtrai, which by the time of the establishment of the Western Front would be a town behind the German lines. But in 1914, during the First Battle of Ypres, Line 69 continued to run normal trains, a normal passenger train service into Ypres via Poperinghe until Ypres was very heavily bombarded at the tail end of First Ypres in November 1914, when the Cloth Hall and some of the other buildings were set on fire and the city was damaged, civilians were killed, and the railway staff in Ypres was then evacuated as it was realised the kind of danger they were in. So the main civilian use of that line came to a conclusion, although remember that civilians continued to live in Ypres until April of 1915. And it was only with the arrival of gas that was when the British were able to ask them to leave. Belgium was our ally, the reason we'd gone to war. We couldn't force the Belgians out of their own homes unless there was a military reason to do so. And with the arrival of poison gas, not enough gas masks for our own troops, let alone Belgian civilians, this was the moment to ask them to leave. And although trains continued to run right up to that period, it wasn't anywhere near the kind of service that had existed, obviously, pre-war. And increasingly that route was used by the military. But not just the British military. First, really, the main army that used that route from France into Belgium via Poperinghe was the French army, because the French army had moved up into Flanders during that First Ypres period, and the size of the expeditionary force then was still small, and this massive French troops had taken part in the First Battle of Ypres, and Poperinghe to Ypres in the winter of 1914-15 was a French sector. The French held the line from the Yser Canal around Bozinga up towards the front line at Langemarck and Polkapel, and then swinging round, joining with some of the British forces further south at Saint-Loire. But that big curve of the kind of Ypres front line was mainly held by French troops in that winter of 1914-15. The British line beginning at Saint-Loire and moving 20-30 miles down into northern France at Le Basset. So this was a French route into the area, and some British troops, particularly during First Ypres, did utilise that route. I have a photo album taken by an officer in one of the Indian divisions who was an Army Service Corps officer, and he carried a camera to war with him in 1914, and he photographed quite a few aspects of the First Battle of Ypres, particularly involving Indian troops. But he was on the railway stations between Hazebrouck and Goddersveld and Poperinghe and Ypres, and he took a number of photographs in those places showing men on the railway stations, showing French troops getting into trains, and a Canadian officer, that one probably more towards early 1915 when the Canadians began to arrive, on a kind of leave train, sitting on a platform with his valise waiting to go on leave or join his unit. And I'll put some of those pictures from that album onto the podcast website. Then the British Railway Operating Division of the Royal Engineers, the ROD, they then take over. The importance of railways had led to the establishment of the ROD and the movement of volunteers or special reservists who were railway workers into this unit, so men were already trained to operate this kind of equipment. The establishment of that was a key moment in the establishment of the wider infrastructure of the British Army on the Western Front. And the Railway Operating Division took over, and they worked on this line to turn it into a military railway rather than a civilian railway carrying local passengers. But the full extension of the line from Hazebrouck to Poperinghe to Ypres couldn't continue to be used from May 1915 onwards, because in that period, that was the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, when using that poison gas, the Germans had captured all the high ground around the city. They could see into Ypres, they could see the railway station, they could see steam trains coming into it, and they could bombard it. So it wasn't practical to run trains into Ypres. So then the terminus of trains thereafter was at Poperinghe, and Poperinghe becomes the main terminus for British forces, and the British build-up of the infrastructure between France and Poperinghe is an important part of the overall establishment of this infrastructure behind the front at Ypres. Sidings are put into place along the line, and at a place called the Remy Farm, about halfway between the border and Poperinghe itself, some sidings are put in there because the farm buildings were being used by the Royal Army Medical Corps as a casualty clearing station. And trains were not just used to move men, ammunition, equipment, food, and so on. They could also be used to move casualties away from the battlefields, ambulance trains. And the sidings were put in at Remy Farm, for example, to pick up the wounded that had been treated at the CCS, the Casualty Clearing Station, and take them further back to base hospitals towards or on the French coast. So that became an important part of this railway infrastructure as well, the way that men were sent up and the way that men came back. And these routes were used to move the men in steam trains with wagons that had 40 men and 8 horses painted on the side. A lot more than 40 men were crammed in there, and they would creep along these tracks, and men would be taken up to one of the sidings to debus, detrain, and then move up to the front line, normally on foot. And they could be used as well to take men away from the front, so they'd end train at Poperinghe as well, to be taken to Hazebrouck and then down to Bethune, for example, to detrain there and then march up to the front line at Festubert or Richebourg or Givenchy or wherever it was. So that was all kind of the process of it. And then if you were one of those that had been sent up to the front line to serve in the trenches and you'd been wounded, evacuated back to the CCS, the train would then take you away from the battlefield and move you nearer and nearer to Blighty. So this is the kind of complexity of it. It was not just men in the trenches sitting there for year after year. They needed a whole infrastructure behind them, and the railways were a massively important part of that. And the railway, Line 69, from Hazebrouck to Goddersveld to Poperinghe, was an important part of that and would remain so for much of the rest of the Great War. Over the next 2 years, the whole network in this area is greatly expanded by the Royal Engineers, the Railway Operating Division, especially during the static warfare period of 1915-17, when Ypres becomes one of the main British sectors on the Western Front. There's no movement except in very small amounts in the front line there, no big battles from the summer of 1915 until the summer of 1917, 2 years of static trench warfare. And the infrastructure to feed that war in Flanders is put in place here and maintained and developed, that would then have lasting effects for the ability to launch offensives later on in the conflict. In March 1916, the volume of men coming in as the army on the Western Front, the British Expeditionary Force, expanded is so great that a second Poperinghe station is built at a hamlet just outside Poperinghe called Poperinghe. And Poperinghe became known as Hop Out because of the name Poperinghe. It looked like Hop Out. The troops called it Hop Out, and that's where you pulled up in a train, you hopped out the train, and you marched up to the front line. So there were 2 main stations, and this shows the importance of Poperinghe as that kind of waypoint for troops going up to the front line. And after that long period of static trench warfare was over, and the approach to Third Ypres began, the Third Battle of Ypres in July to November of 1917. Just before it, the Battle of Messines as well, when the 19 mines were blown along the Messines Ridge. What the railway is then prioritised for during that period, the bombardment at Messines, the bombardment for Third Ypres, the prioritisation is ammunition. The railway becomes about moving shells up to the gun sites to feed those guns, to drop millions of shells onto the German positions and pulverise those German defences to give the men the ability to attack and capture ground. It all becomes part of that great industrial war. The routes feed the men and the shells and the equipment into the war churns it all together, and hopefully at the end of it there is some kind of victory. But there is a victory, even though there's not a breakthrough and an end to the war. The front moves forward in that Third Battle of Ypres. The Freysenberg Ridge is captured, the Bellewaerde Ridge, the Pilkelm Ridge, beyond that the Brunzeinde, and eventually the Passchendaele Ridge. And the Germans are pushed off the high ground, and it's the British who now have the advantage holding those ridges, and it means that the line between Poperinghe and Ypres can be reopened, and trains now run from Poperinghe into Ypres itself, and indeed beyond. When you look at the 1918 trench maps, you'll see the extension of the line and sidings built on areas where they'd been fighting earlier in the war, and men detrain there and then move across the duck bores, across that wasteland that the Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, turned the battlefields around Ypres into. They then move across those duck bores, across that wasteland, up towards the front line. So the railways get nearer, and the whole system linked into a wider network of railways. It wasn't just full-size steam trains on full-size tracks. There was a light railway system as well, the so-called Decauville system, narrow gauge with easily assembled track sections that could be used to carry ammunition, supplies, all kinds of kit. And that was an important part of it. And when you look at the maps of the railway infrastructure around Ypres by 1917-18, it is incredibly complex. And it's working with multiple stations, multiple sidings, spurs out to other areas like Oderdon and Reningels to the southeast, and then links to all of the medical facilities that are in that area as well. So it's become very complex but very efficient to move men, equipment, supplies, food, everything else up, evacuate the wounded, and feed the war on lots of different levels. It changes again with the Battle of the Lys in April 1918, when the Germans attack in Flanders, recapture the high ground, particularly to the south. They retake the Messines Ridge, push on beyond into areas that previously had been behind the British front line, capture those villages beyond there, move towards, across the border, towards the town of Balliol, another important railway junction where soldiers detrained for the front. And all of a sudden, the railway network in the Poperinghe area becomes very exposed. It's very close to the front line, and there's a lot of damage done to it during that period from mid-level artillery, even field artillery, dropping shells down onto the track, and the movement of troops and the effectiveness of that railway is compromised really by the outcome of the Battle of the Lys and the crushing of the front line and the shrinking of the distance between where the forward positions were and where this railway ran. And it wouldn't be until the summer of 1918 that that begins to be addressed as the Germans are gradually pushed back. So who travelled on these routes, though, particularly during that kind of classic 1915 to 1917 period? Well, just about everybody, really. In the early years, as we've mentioned, Belgian civilians went about their kind of business, really, still using the train to commute between France and Belgium. And then in 1915, as the war became real for these civilians, over 12,000 Belgian refugees travelled along this line to get away from the bombardments and eventually to get away from the gas. But when it became a main military route, men from every corner of the British Empire, the Commonwealth, came here. Men from every kind of background that you could imagine travelled along this railway. And it's recounted time and time again in memoirs, interviews with veterans, classic books of the Great War. It's such an important part of the experience of soldiers travelling along these kind of lines. And they even had royal passengers travel along the lines in this area when King Albert of the Belgians and his wife travelled on a train operated by the 2nd Australian Light Railway Company in August of 1918. They were using a Decauwille narrow gauge system northeast of Poperinghe, and the King and his wife travelled on it for around about 3 hours at different places. The King later saying that it had, and I quote, better punctuality than the Boulogne to Paris Express. And that kind of shows how efficient these railways were. So that's the kind of wartime history of it, an important layer in our understanding of the history of the Great War, particularly here in Flanders with this route from Hazebrouck to Poperinghe to Ypres and everything that entailed. But what can we find of it on the landscape of the Western Front today? Well, starting just northeast of Hazebrouck, the line is now walking and cycling and riding routes. Tracks that were torn up in the 1970s have been replaced by a tarmac surface along the old railway bed, and you can walk along there, follow that route that the trains took up to and towards the front line. And you can follow it on and off, except where it's cut at one point by the modern motorway, and up to the old station site at Goddersveld, God Wears Velvet, as the troops called that village, and then across the border into Belgium itself. Goddersveld, just that side of the border in France. A billeting area for troops, the site of another casualty clearing station. There's a cemetery in the village there. So an important part of the infrastructure in this area. And then you can follow it as you come out of Goddersveld up towards that embankment that we mentioned at the very beginning, which is so easily missed from the main road to Poperinghe, and then continue along the edge of that main road and up into Remy sidings and Lissenherk military cemetery as it is today, with the visitor centre, and soon this diorama, this covered diorama, which I'm hoping is the model railway diorama that they showed in an exhibition a few years ago, which was a beautifully crafted diorama showing the railway lines around Poperinghe and the layout of the track and so on, which I think will help, young minds, students coming to the battlefields, to help visualise kind of what this was really all about and how important it was. And then you can follow it into Poperinghe itself. Well, again, along the line of the old track, you can go through parts of the town and then into the area of the station that is still operable, still operating, still used to this day. And when you stand on that station, you look at some original images of it, and I'll put a pre-war postcard of Poperinghe Station onto the podcast website. It's pretty much unchanged. It feels very much unchanged, and you can go onto the platform. Even if you don't take a train, you can kind of imagine soldiers walking there and getting onto trains. They could get leave trains back to Blighty from there. They got trains that took them later on in the conflict up towards the front line or away to another sector, another battle, another day, another fight somewhere. It's an incredibly evocative place. And a few years ago, when we were making a series for the BBC for the 90th anniversary of the Great War, I brought newsreader Kate Silverton here to follow her relative who was in the Rifle Brigade, who got trench fever at Ypres. And he stood on this station at one point, and she kind of felt shivers when she stood there, thinking that she's literally walking in the footsteps of him. And many of us who have ancestors who fought at Ypres, they will have passed through Poperinghe at some point. It's part of their Great War experience. So if you get the opportunity to go to Poperinghe and just stand on the station, it's a really great experience to do so and compare it to some of the wartime photos. And then at Poperinghe itself today, of course, you can finally get on a train, which you can't do from Hazebrouck and Goddersveld. You've got to walk it because the track's gone. But here the track is still operable from Poperinghe to Ypres to Kortrijk and beyond. And you can get on a train. There's more than 20 departures, I think, each day. And the journey to Ypres is only about a quarter of an hour. But what a journey it is. It comes out of Poperinghe station. It runs close to the old routes, the old road that ran between Poperinghe and Ypres. And you begin to pass those beacons on the landscape, those cemeteries, the silent cities of the Great War. You see the Brandherk cemeteries where the casualty clearing stations were, where Chavas died and where he's buried. You see Red Farm Cemetery just by the road, and you see Railway Chateau Cemetery named after the railway. And there are quite a few cemeteries that have railway in the title. Maybe that's the subject for another podcast. And then you follow it eventually into Ypres itself. It's a short journey, and I've done it a few times back and forth. It really is a rewarding journey. You see a different aspect of the Great War by taking the train and following these routes. And if you follow it beyond Ypres, that was a route that was not running during the war, but if you follow it beyond Ypres, it takes you out past Shrapnel Corner, Transport Farm Cemetery at Zillebeek, through the cutting at Hill 60, around the back of Hollebeek, and down to Comines on the border with France, and then beyond to Courtrai, when you're behind, effectively, the German lines, or you're in ground that wasn't taken until the very end of the Great War. There is something in these train journeys, and it's something I want to return to. And on the podcast YouTube channel, that is something to look out for in the future. But we mentioned right at the beginning how the trains and the railways are the arteries of modern warfare. That was the view before the conflict even began. And today, on these battlefields, I think they still remain so. Very few people follow railway routes across these battlefields. Perhaps more should. I've discussed this in previous podcasts. But for me, there's no doubt that taking the train, even along this route between Poperinghe and Ypres, it adds another level, another layer to our understanding of the history of the Great War, of the landscape of that conflict as it is today. And the trains run ever onwards through these battlefields, past these cemeteries, right through the very heart of the old front line. You've been listening to Despatches, part of the Old Front Line podcast, with me, military historian Paul Reed. If you've enjoyed this episode, please think about leaving a review on your favourite podcast platform, giving us a rating, and leaving a comment on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. You can follow us on Twitter, and if you want to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/oldfrontline, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon.